Welcome to a special edition of the France 24 debate. Here in Europe, the commemorations are already well underway. 100 years ago, next August, soldiers were happily heading to the front for a short campaign. Nach Paris in 3 Wochen, to Paris in 3 weeks, crowed the Germans, echoing an identical optimism in both the French and British capitals. The rest, as they say, is history. When we remember World War I, we remember men used as cannon fodder, a mass slaughter made possible by new technology that included planes and chemical weapons, and leaders who utterly failed to see that change. Despite the recent passing of the very last veterans, these commemorations still resonate. Empires crumbled, new borders would be drawn up in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, and of course, one world war would beget another. It took 70 years for French and German leaders to join hands at the battlefield of Verdun. That was in 1984. We sometimes forget that the founding principle of today's Europe was, to put it bluntly, a plan to get the French and Germans to stop killing each other. In that respect, the EU fully deserves its Nobel Peace Prize. But when the award came in 2012, critics found the tribute, well, a little outdated. Today, an aging continent has other worries, recession and the Eurozone crisis, sparking what some see as a new leadership crisis that spawned the rise of identity politics on the far right. With Europe again being put to the test, what lessons will we draw from the events of 100 years ago? Joining us, he's one of France's preeminent voices on Europe, Prague-born political scientist Jacques Rupnik, who, at another defining moment of Europe, you advised Václav Havel when there was the Velvet Revolution taking place, when it was being completed. Thank you for being with us.
Pleasure.
Also, he's born in Frankfurt, but he's a member of the French Parliament. Socialist Matthias Fekl, thank you for being with us. And
thank you.
To borrow a line from Barack Obama, you have Europe in your DNA.
Thanks.
She has Europe in her in tray every week when she files for The Economist. Paris bureau chief Sophie Petter, welcome. And caused quite a stir, by the way, last year with a book in French, which was entitled France. I'll translate it as France in Denial, the Last Spoiled Children of Europe. Is there a translation on the way?
Not yet.
Not yet, okay.
In the works.
He's a kind of soldier that would have been unthinkable in 1914. General Dominique Trinquant, a UN field commander for years, most notably during the conflict in the former Yugoslavia. Welcome back to the show. The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and on Twitter, our hashtag F24debate. Dominique Trinquant, you were telling us before the show began that those first days of August 1914, you lost a great uncle.
Yeah, a great uncle was killed. My two grandfathers were in their regiments, and that was the start of a very difficult war. And I was saying also that years after that, I meet with my grandfather, former German soldier, on the battlefield. My grandfather was visiting the battlefield with me, and it was impressive to see these two men saying that we're fighting each other and now we are friends.
And when you went to the battlefield, what did your grandfather tell you about it?
How difficult it was. How difficult it was. He was an officer, and he was always admiring his soldier, saying they were marvelous people, fighting for 4 years in very difficult condition. But there was no discussion about stopping the fight. But at the end, in 1918, when there was a discussion to take the Ruhr, you know, and there were discussion. And he said the people who are saying that at Parliament have never been in a trench. They don't know what it is to fight. We want to stop now.
Don't know what it is to fight. We'll pick up on that point in a moment. Jacques Rupnik, you were telling us that you had grandparents who were on both sides.
It just so happens that one of my French grandfather was in the French army, and another grandfather was in the Austrian army, as I discovered later. So, yeah, so this is sort of a personal interest in that story. But beyond that, I think what many Europeans discovered later on, that this war was not just like the previous wars we had in Europe. This was a war that sort of destroyed the continent. This was the beginning of the big suicide of Europe, which lasted from 1914 to 1945 and basically destroyed the place, made it run by others, half by the Soviet Union, half by the United States. And you can say really that from that war came out two totalitarian systems, two totalitarian ideologies. From the destruction, from that horrible trauma of the First World War, we had communism. That was one response, the Bolshevik Revolution, and fascism was a second response to it. And that is beyond the personal histories in each of our families we can find. That was, I think, what makes Europeans think hard about what happened in 1914.
Sophie Petter, as someone who has covered Africa, a continent that's finding it difficult to transit from a rural-based society to an urban one. We look back at World War I, and it was that slaughter of World War I that, in fact, accelerated the process of that transition. Do you sometimes wonder today if there's any lessons that can be drawn in that respect?
I think it's so different. I mean, you can't draw comparisons between the slaughter, as you put it, you know, the horrors of the First World War. You've seen some horrific events, you know, the genocide in Rwanda and what's happening in the Central African Republic at the moment are obviously examples of what can happen when, you know, an African country descends into sort of chaos. But the scale of these was nothing compared with what happened in Europe. So I think, you know, one has to be careful about drawing those sorts of parallels. I think that the...
But when you hear Jack Rupnik mention how the transition, this chaos, in other words, begins in 1914, but doesn't really end until 1945.
No, and I mean, there's a strong historical argument which says precisely that argues that there weren't sort of two neat discrete wars with a period in between that can be separated, that in fact the period 1914 to 1945 was a continuum, and that the construction of Europe as we know it today began obviously in after the Second World War, and that was in a sense the first, not the first effort, but the first successful effort to turn Europe's back on what had been you know, a horrific experience twice. But with mixed results, as we know. You know, and Europe has not escaped war just because we've had the European Union. We've known war on our doorstep. The general was involved personally in that, and it's something that Europeans have struggled even in very, very recent history. We're talking about the First World War, which for all of us is family memory in history books. But the Bosnian wars in the Balkans, Bosnia, Kosovo, these are things that have happened in our lifetimes, and I think, you know, are reminders that, you know, Europe has really had to work very, very hard at overcoming those sort of conflicts and putting in place the structures that hopefully will really turn never again into a reality.
And we're going to talk about those structures a little bit later on. Matthias Feckel, you're the junior member of this panel. When you were growing up in Berlin, World War I wasn't something people talked about much.
No. What you see in Berlin is more the rests of World War II. And more generally, in Germany, I think the Second World War, for obvious reasons, is much more present, even today, than World War I. World War I was fought mostly on French soil, not on German soil. And so I think in German memory, it's not as present, as important as in France. In France, you can see in every village you have a monument for the children of France who died in this awful conflict and this slaughter. And you don't have this in such an obvious way in Germany.
But for you personally, is this, well, history?
It is history, but I'm very fond of history. I try to read lots of history books, and you always have to look at the past to try to act in the present. And this war, just as World War II, is very important. First, to see the destruction of Europe, of old Europe, as Jacques Rupnik said, this slaughter and this awful 20th century in the first part. And then it's also an explanation of why we are trying to build the European Union to have peace on the continent, which was not obvious at all for centuries and centuries, and these two wars prove it.
All right, we'll see how that message is resonating. I want to get back to something that General Trinquant was saying about his grandfather on the battlefield, who admired his foot soldiers and who complained about the suits, as we call them now, who didn't quite get a grasp of what was going on. The few World War I veterans that I have had the privilege of interviewing surprisingly lacked qualms. They were proud to have served. They proved evasive or sometimes unsympathetic when I mentioned the execution of mutineers or deserters. Others did speak out, though, showing particular disgust for their desk-bound superior officers.
The trouble was that the people who gave these orders for the attacks were in a chateau 10 miles behind the line. Had never been to the trenches. They didn't know the conditions, what the conditions were like.
In that respect, what's changed since that war? Has there been a lesson learned from superior officers who are out of touch with what's really going on the battlefield?
Certainly, we are talking about a different society. Just remember that starting the First World War, a lot of the soldiers were coming from the countryside, were peasants. We found that the conditions were very difficult. In fact, in the farms, the conditions were very difficult. And you have these people who were coming from the school I'm coming, Saint-Cyr, were highly educated people coming from cities. And so there were a big difference. Currently, probably the difference between a soldier and officer is less important than it was at that time. But it's the evolution of the society, and the army reflects the society. So that's probably why when we see this picture, it reflects exactly the society at that time. You have one man, we are discussing about an anniversary this year, Clemenceau, who was able to go into the trench. And even I saw images where he is jumping out of the trench and shouting to the German. He was one of the MP able to do that. And even the general were with him and say, be careful, it's dangerous. Of course, war is dangerous. And he was responsible as the Prime Minister in France, able to do that. So, but that's not it is an example. But
it's more of a counterexample.
Yeah, exactly. The people at that time were doing things like that, you know. And probably now you're seeing the people. I was in Bosnia, as you said. My commander, who I admire very much, General Kotz, at that time, was doing and patrolling with a soldier. And he was a 5-star general. And sometimes soldier was a bit amazed about that. But that's the role of the officer now in the army.
All right, the French army was a different place. France was a different place. Jacques Rupnik, we often forget that more than half the French army didn't speak French as a first language at the time. And people still spoke their local patois or dialect. And you think just how much of a schism it was coming out of that.
Well, certainly. There's a book by Eugene Weber, Peasants into Frenchmen. You know, he describes how the different regional differences, the dialects, etc., all this blend throughout the 19th century, through the school system, through public administration, and finally concluded, as he said, in the trenches of World War I, where all the soldiers were mixed together. So yes, the World War I completes, if you want, this sort of idea from the French Revolution, the army of citizens, and citizenship and nationality being one. That is perhaps one aspect of it. But the trauma of that war, I think, is just as important, perhaps even more important to remember. That trauma of that generation that lived through the World War I, their total disillusionment with the institutions, often with the way the war had been conducted. That explains to a large extent not only the radicalization of some, I alluded to that, you know, some became communists, some became going to the far right, but also the prevailing pacifism of the interwar period. If you want to understand why people were so slow at opposing Hitler in the 1930s, it's because the last thing they wanted is to embark on yet another war or another conflict. So you had a lot of very well-intentioned people from left and right, moderate left and moderate right, who were pacifists because of the trauma of World War I, and therefore were becoming blind to the real danger that was coming with the totalitarian regime in Germany and its new imperialist designs. So yes, that is one of the lessons. You know, sometimes you fight the previous war and you forget about the one that is looming ahead.
1914, Sophie Petter, the British pound is the planet's currency of reference. When the war ends, of course, the American dollar has started to overtake it. At the time already, we're talking about a Europe that's passé, that's decadent. Sounds familiar, right, when you hear the conversation going on today?
Well, I mean, yes, your first point, absolutely. It was the end in the way. It was the end, in a sense, of the sort of domination of world affairs by the colonial powers. I mean, that was something that, you know, increasingly became the American century. The end of the sort of European domination. That was very much marking that moment. I think what you're hinting at there is the sort of, you know, are there parallels between recession, Great Depression, difficulties in the 1930s and today's Euro crisis? And, you know, is that there's a question here which is sometimes raised, which is, are we seeing a return to a sort of populist, far-right, possibly neo-fascist movements in Europe? I mean, I think
the idea of a Europe that's past it.
Possibly, but I think what I wanted to say was that you have to be very careful, I think, of this parallel. I mean, quite a lot of sort of scare stories about, you know, when you look at what's happening with Golden Dawn in Greece, for example, some extremely sinister and unpleasant and violent neo-fascist movements which do exist in Europe and didn't exist and have thrived on the back of disillusion with Europe and of austerity and of unemployment. But, you know, there are also, I think, something sort of less sinister in a violent way, but nonetheless very demanding a lot of attention, and that's the sort of rise of populism and Euroscepticism in Europe at the moment. And that, I think, is really Europe's challenge. You know, yes, in a way, we've managed to turn the page on conflict up to a point, but that is something. It is unthinkable now, I think, for France and Germany to see each other in a direct conflict. But whether or not the next generation feels that way and has that same sense of sort of historical obligation to maintain peace at the centre of European movement, I think is really a question, because if you look at some of the movements that are emerging, some of these sort of xenophobic, based on a lot of Euroscepticism mixed with a kind of anti-immigrant flavour. And this is happening in Norway, it's happening in Denmark, in Holland, in the Netherlands, in France, in Europe, with the Eurosceptics, in Britain as well. European Euroscepticism is thriving at the moment. It's not, as I said, it's not a return to fascism, but it is a return to a sort of disillusion and scepticism about Europe, which I think is really something quite new.
We're going to pick up on the point of what that disillusionment all means 100 years after the start of World War I when we come back. This is the France 24 debate.